So today, I didn't want to talk about creative products. I didn't want to talk about making ideas happen, other things that I wanted to talk about a new project and passion that's sort of evolved for me over the past few years. And it's this obsession around what I like to call the middle. And the middle of any sort of creative project or bold venture, journey, I feel doesn't get enough attention and should. So I think I'll start by just kind of dispelling the myth of a creative journey, which probably most of you know is a myth. But this is the myth that there's just like incredible joy of conception followed by this reality of, oh my gosh, this is really, really hard. And then a progressive linear line towards a great outcome. And what we all know is that the reality of this is a little bit more like this, where there is a lot of joy in the beginning, so conception is fun, and then you kind of realize how fucking hard this is, and then you're kind of feeling it, and then you have a bump, and then you have a recovery, and then another bump, and it's just like extraordinarily volatile and seemingly endless middle, right, towards some sort of hopeful finish, for lack of a better term. And I think the best we can possibly aspire for is a positive slope, where somehow, some way, every valley is less low and every peak is incrementally higher. And if we can just have a positive slope, somehow, some way, we will end with something that we are proud of. And so I think the question is, how do we get through this middle? Now, what's interesting to me is that the world, especially press and books, typically focuses on the sexy parts, the starts and the finishes. And if you read any sort of headlines, everything is about a start or a finish. The romanticism of people in their dorm room getting something off the ground, or dropping out of business school, or never going to school and starting something, and then also the finishes, the acquisitions and the bankruptcies. Regardless of how something finishes, people love covering starts and finishes. And I think it's because what can be summed, right, is really easy to celebrate. But what is too dynamic to really summarize is often overlooked. And the middle is dynamic. I mean, everyone I think in this room knows that. So this is this question, right, about, well, what is the middle? When I'm asked, in an interview or something like that, so tell me about the story of Behance, I'm always like, well, late 2005, I was thinking of this idea about organizing the creative world. People were like, yeah, good luck with that. I met a few people, Matthias, my co-founder, Dave, Brian, a few other folks who helped me kind of get this off the ground from a design and technology perspective. And then we bootstrapped for about 5 years. We got venture backing for about a year and a half. We got acquired by Adobe, and it was an incredible journey. And just with 60 seconds, pithy in a nutshell, that's the story. And it really tells you nothing. It doesn't really answer 5 years of bootstrapping, meaning you were always 2 months away from not making salary. How did you get through that? And what was it like in year 2.5 when you had no end in sight and no one really knew what the hell you were doing and people couldn't even pronounce the name of your company? How did that feel? And there's all these questions, right, that actually come up in terms of this story. And I think everyone's story kind of skips over the middle. And I think a big reason is because we want to forget it. It's extraordinarily mundane. It's flush with insecurity and anonymity and ambiguity and uncertainty, and it's just not a fun place to live or think. And so for the past few years, I actually have started interviewing a lot of entrepreneurs and artists and writers and others, asking them about their middles. And it's a very hard thing to do because people, again, don't really remember. They kind of don't even think about it. And so I figured, of course, I need to start with my middle to understand what this is all about. And I really tried to think about the years kind of 2006 to 2010 or so, 2011, which these are middle years. And they were all a blur. I really couldn't actually remember what the hell I was doing for 5 years. And so, which begs the question, what are the stuff that matters the most, this middle, that ultimately determines the outcome of what we're doing? What if that's the stuff we actually want to forget? So what do we do when we have a question in life or when we're just not sure what to do with our time? We go to our phones. And so I went to my phone and I went to Photos, Apple Photos, and I just like fast flicked back, into these middle years. I was just like, okay, well, if I don't remember, I gotta stimulate my memory a little bit. And so I went back and I started to go through what the hell I was capturing on my phone in those middle years. And what did I find? First of all, I found tons of screenshots. And it was amazing. First of all, it was amazing to see screenshots of my digital products before the world of responsive web design. Because, if you remember, like, the web was not really responsive back then, or most of it wasn't. But also, I couldn't believe how much of my time at like 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. or midnight or 7 a.m., just at all times, I was constantly capturing these screenshots of the products, of bugs, of things that I just wanted to send to a team member to remember to talk about something. It was just a constant processing of the stuff that I was working on at all hours of the day and night. And I just was amazed by how much of the middle was just consumed by just this constant, obsession over what wasn't working, what could be better. I also was surprised by how many screenshots I had of what customers were saying about our products. Now, I think a lot of these were capturing bugs or things that people thought were bad or pissed off about or whatever, but I have to admit, I think a lot of this was also an attempt to find some sense of reward in an early stage product where there was no reward. No one, again, really knew what the hell we were doing, so whenever someone actually knew, it was like, oh my gosh, that's great. And I wanted to share that with the team. It was almost like manufacturing some sort of non-financial reward out of thin air. And I was always trying to capture it, apparently. What else? We were doing paper products to bootstrap our business in the early days, and it was just amazing how many pictures in my middle were just about, again, things that were wrong. My obsession over quality and like the things that were wrong, sending them to the factory, saying what the hell's going on here, like all that kind of stuff consumed my camera roll. I also found a lot of pictures around progress. Pictures that, whether it was stuff done or celebration moments or pictures of a screen when we reach a certain milestone. And I think I was doing that to kind of capture proof of progress because I felt like it would beget more progress. And for myself and for my team, again, to kind of remind ourselves that we actually are making progress. It may not feel that way, but we are. There were lots of pictures like that, and of the team, just of the team working, being together, the setups that we had, the moments that we had in various conferences or places or whatever, always trying to document these moments as a way, I think, to also build texture into an experience that could so easily slip through our hands and not be remembered, to make us feel, again, that sense of progress and of team. I also came across pictures of my honeymoon. And we were in Thailand and Cambodia, and it conjured back two sets of memories. One which was excitement of being away and getting married and everything else. And then also, I just remember this pit in my stomach the whole time, thinking I have this team at home, working, and they're, we're going to run out of money at some point if we don't do something, a step function more productive than we're doing right now. And should I even be away? And can I actually be here and be present and experience this? And I really saw these pictures, and I remembered this tear, that I constantly had, even in what's supposed to be one of the most joyous and free thinking or just out of the zone type of experiences in life. And I came across a lot of pictures that were sort of depressing to me. For example, me staring at a spoon, taking a picture. I think it reminded me of the fact that at one point I cooked this anti-nausea medication because I was so anxious at periods of time and felt alone, And when you're starting something up and someone's like, "How's it going?" You're supposed to say, "Great," because you're supposed to be excited and feeling the momentum of what you're building. In fact, oftentimes you are fucking freaking out, and that's just the reality, right? I think that my exploration of my own middle made me realize that it was just, I could sum it up by trying to stay afloat long enough to figure it out. Trying to stay afloat long enough to become the leader that I needed to be of this enterprise, build the team that we needed to succeed, achieve the product market fit, build the brand that we were proud of, and it was just the staying power. So if you look at this graph again, I feel like the middle comes down to two things. One is, how do you endure those low points? How do you stay with it? And then how do you optimize like hell anything that's working? And so what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about some of the things that I came across in these interviews that I've been doing over the past few years of people rethinking and processing their own middles, and share them with you. So let's start with endure. I guess the first I would say, and I alluded to this already, is the need to accept the burden of processing uncertainty at all times. Because the reality is, if you have a 9-to-5 job, you can turn it off. But if you are trying to build something that you are deeply passionate about, that is a part of who you are, for better or for worse, that's not always a good thing, you have to accept the fact that a part of your brain will constantly be processing the uncertainty related to your endeavor. Now, I think that part of this requires us to tune it down as much as possible at times. I mean, one of the tricks that I always had is I would say to myself, and someone else came up with this idea, I remember hearing it, but like, is this within or outside of my circle of influence? You know, sometimes I would just find myself really laboring over something, and I would just say, that is literally outside of your circle of influence. You can't do anything about it. And I would just try to say that to myself over and over. A lot of other folks that I met along the way of the middle research just talked about sometimes visibly, out loud, audibly saying to themselves, like, you can't do anything about this. So try to minimize the processing of uncertainty that you can't control. And but a lot of the stuff you can control, it just takes a lot of time to bake. And whether it's a big decision you're making or a problem you're trying to solve, the reality is that you're going to be living with it, and you have to learn to kind of live with that constant. Short-circuiting your team's reward systems is something that I feel is really important. Because in the middle, again, there's no end in sight oftentimes. You're not making any necessarily financial return yet. You're not getting the gratification from your community or your customers. And so how do you hack it? So there is a few thoughts here, right? Obviously, one of them is to create funny milestones. In our team at Behance, there were a few funny ones. First of all, I've been a vegetarian for 26 years. And for whatever reason, my team said, hey, when we had like 7,000 members of Behance, if we ever reach 100,000, you have to eat meat. So I was like, sure, whatever, that's never gonna happen. And then, truth be told, a couple of years later, someone had the thing that I signed, and we were at a Christmas dinner, and I had to eat meat off of one of our developers' forks. Somehow became part of the deal. And but that was like one of those, we called them slap bets. I don't know why we called them that, but there were a lot of those that carried us through to the finish line. Another one that I remember is searching Behance in Google. When we first started the business, Behance, every time we searched, Google would say, do you mean enhance? Do you mean enhance? And there was this internal goal, this prize of not being a mistake in Google anymore. And so that went on for years until one day, someone on our team searched Behance and it came up. And it was like, oh my goodness, like this is a major milestone. Of course, it has nothing to do with real reward or real impact necessarily, but we were just trying to get as many portfolios, as many blog posts, as many link backs, as many whatever. It was this goal that we were working towards to try to actually no longer be a mistake as a company. And then I kid you not, a year later, Beyonce became super popular and we lost it again. It really is true. If you avoid folks that are polarizing, you avoid bold outcomes. I think this is really true. One of CreativeMornings' first speakers and one of our first speakers at 99U, Seth Godin, calls this making a ruckus. And you have to have people in your team that ask the unpopular questions that may have an edge to them that is sometimes uncomfortable, but are the people that call out the elephants in the room and push people's buttons. And the problem is when we hire people, we typically want to hire people that we want to have a beer with, when in fact we need to hire people that really challenge the way that we think, that push us in uncomfortable ways, and that cause that sort of necessary ruckus. And it was a challenge for me as a leader earlier on. When you're building a small team, you just want everyone to be a family. But as we all know, every family has a drunk uncle or something like that, right? So you need to kind of think about how do you round out your team with people that are pushing you in uncomfortable ways, and how do you build that into your hiring process? I mean, one of the most dangerous terms that we probably all use when bringing people onto a team is like, are they a culture fit? It's a dangerous term because culture fit can mean many things. It can mean, hey, we have a shared set of values, which is maybe okay, but it oftentimes means, are they like us? Do they look like us? Do they talk like us? Do they think like us? And that is actually a warning sign in a number of ways that you want to make sure you avoid. I really believe this, especially now that I'm in a big company. Again, my ultimate acquirer, I've now come back and said, okay, I think there's a lot of fixing to do in terms of the tools and services that creative people use. I'm jumping in and really trying to lead change in many instances at Adobe. And what I find is that it's so true, especially in a big team, that the future is crafted by those who do work they don't have to do. It is crafted by people who think a little bit outside of their job lines. I mean, if you think about it, if we all just stuck to what we are told to do by someone who thinks they know the future but is really overwhelmed by the present, we will never actually create something new. And if you think about it, innovation is really people kind of sidestepping, taking the liberty of thinking a little bit beyond what they're asked to accomplish. And I think the message here is when you care about a mission and you actually care about the product you are building, and you care about your team, you have to care indiscriminately. You really have to think about everything that matters to the outcome you're trying to achieve versus the thing that you think you're supposed to be doing or that you're told to do. And I think that's one of the secrets to building a great product, whatever size team or company you're in. So this is something that I've said to myself many times in the middle, and I found other people that I interviewed that talked about a similar sort of message they would tell themselves, or a forcing function that they would use with themselves to make very difficult decisions, whether it was to fire somebody, which is extraordinarily hard. I mean, if you know that someone is sort of toxic within your team, you know that they're not doing their job as well as everyone else, and if you don't act as the leader, everyone else is going to leave because people want to be in a job where they feel that they're doing the best work of their lives. And if they feel like there's someone around them that is not there with them, eventually they'll leave. And so you have to make this tough decision. And I hated the prospect, especially when they were people that I liked personally. And there were many instances of other hard decisions that were made in terms of killing a product that was successful enough to maybe keep doing, but was detracting from the thing that we thought could really make a dent in the industry and a dent in the world. And in these instances, I would oftentimes just whisper to myself, either before going in the room or before the meeting or whatever, just saying, like, Scott, do your fucking job. I would try to just kind of tell myself that this is the burden of leading this team. Like, you have to do this, and if you put it off more, I mean, listen, the easiest decisions to make are to not make a decision yet. And sometimes the most important thing we can do at the helm of a project is just to keep the ship moving, just to be decisive. And we have to, force ourselves to do it. The last piece here on endure is just the point about how much more important resourcefulness is than resources. And as an investor, and I'm sure all of you know so many examples of companies that have raised, almost infinite amounts of resources and have completely failed. And yet other companies who have bootstrapped or raised a very small amount, are very successful. And I just think that resourcefulness is like muscle, right? It's there with you always. It helps you in ways you don't even realize. Whereas resources is you can just spend through it and end with nothing. It doesn't have any sort of lasting resiliency and applicability towards everything else that you will encounter. And so I always think that we should strive for resourcefulness, and how this translates into everyone's reality in here is, we would all want bigger budgets, right? For anything we're doing for a client or within our own business, any product we're developing. And so we should kind of turn that around, right? Instead of saying, hey, we don't have enough to execute what we want to make happen, it's like, how do we use ingenuity and build our resourcefulness as a muscle to make this happen with what we've got. And that is, I think, a true difference between very successful teams and teams that struggle in the middle. All right, so those are a few thoughts on endure. And there are many more, but we have like 20 minutes, so I'm like racing through this. But the next piece here is, okay, so we talked about how to kind of manage some of those valleys. Now, how do we encounter some of those peaks? And some of those peaks, I would say, this starts with this idea of investing in both your product and your organization or team in equal parts. Because we typically only focus on the product. I mean, especially at any early stage venture or project, it's like, hey, we just have to make something. And so we invest all of our energy into the brand or the marketing or the product itself, and we sometimes woefully ignore the operation, the machine. And what does this mean? It means, how do you meet? Do you meet every Tuesday just because it's Tuesday? Do you have certain processes that you use or certain tools that you use internally that should be optimized? Should you run sort of A/B tests of the way that you work with your team, where literally every week you change something, or every few weeks you change a thing that you do and how you work together, and then you see if that works, and if it doesn't work, you revert back to the previous version. And if it does work, you adopt that as a change, and then you continue with another test. The best teams are also parallel processing their own development of their organization. I remember when Ben Silbermann, in 2010, when he was building Pinterest, I remember meeting him and becoming an advisor for his team. And then the next year, in 2011, I kind of asked him when we met up in San Francisco, so what are your big goals for the next year? And I was thinking roadmap and all these new features he wants to launch and all this revenue goals or whatever else. And he looked at me, he was like, for the next 6 to 12 months, my number one goal is to build a better process. And I was like, huh. He's like a couple years into his business. That seems like I don't know, it seems like he's maybe not where maybe that should be something he aspires for later on, not so soon. But that was what was most important to him. And he was one of those leaders I felt did this extraordinarily well, valuing the team and the organization and processes just as much as the product that he was building in terms of his investment. So innovation, right, is a buzzword, and everyone's always talking about where do ideas come from and how do you innovate within a product or whatever else, or in a team. And I have now come to believe, again, after talking to a lot of people about their middle and where great ideas came from, Joe Gebbia, other folks, now big companies as well as small companies and individuals, and that have collaborators. And I've become convinced that innovation in some ways happens at the edge of reason. It's that edge that becomes a center, and that's easy to say, but the edge looks weird, right? The edge is like, well, that's not gonna ever be a thing, and then that suddenly becomes a thing, and before you know it, you are at the cusp of what's next. But in order to do that, you have to have a team around you with people that think unreasonably. When you're solving a problem, they say something that at first sounds strange. And then as you debate it out, it starts to become a little more familiar, and then suddenly it's interesting. And then I guess the question is, how do you stack the deck in building your team, and as you optimize the way that you work and grow your team over time to innovate at the edge of reason? And I think the only answer is to hire people that are extraordinary people that are extraordinarily different, right? And I think this kind of goes into that case for diversity as a force that sustains differentiation. When you hire people, and the shortcut to this, although diversity I don't think is limited to biological checkboxes and that sort of thing, but the shortcut is to actually hire people with remarkably different backgrounds, who look differently, who speak differently. And these are the people that are likely to think of solutions that you think are unreasonable at first, because their backgrounds, the surface area of what they're going through in their brains is just different enough from yours that there will be something that you think is at first unreasonable that is actually an edge that becomes the center. And so I think we should kind of embrace that, and that needs to be a litmus test in how we're building our teams. So a lot of people ask me, how do you make an investment decision in a team or a company? And actually, it really, if I boil it down to one thing, it's when I come across people that are working on an idea that I'm excited about, with an interesting skill set, but most importantly, with whom discussions evolve by a step function every time we have them. Most people, when we meet them, and then we meet them again, we talk about the same thing. And even friends and stuff like that, it's like, you kind of go through the same sort of stuff. Like, how have you been? What's going on? How's the job? And or you talk about politics or whatever it is. But sometimes you meet people, and in professional context especially, where every conversation seems to be a step function more interesting than the one before it. And you feel like, from a chemistry perspective, you're building upon one another. You're getting deeper into the opportunity, or you're just abstracting away some of the minutiae, and you're kind of making it more and more and more engaging. And I think that's one of the things you need to look for as you're building a team, working with people, determining also the clients. If you get the luxury of choosing which clients you work with, like which are the ones that kind of are more interesting by a step function each time you do an engagement with them. It's just like a practice that you can apply to the decisions you make around people in your life. So there's another sort of common cliche, right? That is just sort of follow your passion and drive with passion in terms of what you want to create. I meet a lot of entrepreneurs and I'll ask them, so why are you doing this? They're like, well, I've been passionate about this forever. It's always been my passion to X. And that is, to them, like the reason why, they are destined to do this. And I think actually one of the biggest problems with entrepreneurship in general today is that people are leading with passion rather than empathy, right? They're leading with passion for the solution that they get excited about versus empathy for the customers suffering the problem they're trying to solve. And I think it's an important point because we get carried away, especially as creative people, with something in our mind's eye that we want to make happen. And we oftentimes skip through, consciously or not, the step of actually making sure we're empathetic with the customer solving the problem. And there have been so many examples in the Silicon Valley of teams that have built companies, for independent workforce or whatever else, where they actually didn't really spend any time with these, cleaners or hairdressers or anyone else that they were actually trying to solve a problem for. And I think that's one of those fatal flaws. And as you're optimizing what you're doing and as you're refining your product over time, making sure that you lead yourself more with empathy than passion, I think, is actually an important part of the equation. When we look at process and productivity in our teams and the velocity of decision making and the durability of decisions that we do make, I think a big thing that we have to recognize is that as humans, we always want to feel like we're making progress, right? Back to my pictures in the beginning, we always want to feel like we're moving the ball forward. And as a result, we have a tendency to favor small problems over big problems. We love to check a lot of boxes and make sure we feel productive versus taking a bite out of a very big problem that will actually move the ball forward in a dramatic and defensible way. When it comes to a competitive marketplace, the big thing that you solve will really protect you over time. All those little things everyone else can solve also. And so there's something to be said about making yourself have this bias towards some of those big problems. And in a big company, I think that translates to just pushing for a decision. And if you have a boss or someone who needs to ultimately make the decision, it's okay for you to say, I need you to make a decision by Friday. And just to be a forcing function for decisiveness, to move the ball forward on some of the bigger problems that are ultimately going to make you successful. I think that there's also in most teams, especially teams that operate like families, this drive towards consensus. We all want to be on board with something, and the problem with consensus is that we can ultimately land with the lowest common denominator solution that just is good enough for everyone to say, okay, I agree. And in almost every industry, you can track back great decisions to conviction that actually defied consensus. I know in the investment world, a lot of the top venture capital firms will talk about their most important investments as the most controversial, where actually the partners who were deciding to make the investment didn't agree. And there was one partner that everyone respected so much who just slammed the fist down and said, we have to do this. Like, I just know this. And so it's something for us to all think about with our teams, is to really respect people's level of conviction. And rather than always strive for consensus, should we always be looking out for the moments where someone has such extreme belief and intuition about something based on whatever their background is, that we actually give more credence to conviction over consensus. So another thing that I think is important as we decide like what to do next, right? New job opportunities, new clients, is we have an affinity towards things that are shiny and new and seemingly, seemingly sexy things to do, right? We will love to take like the famous client over the client no one's heard of, or we would love to, we would love to work at a company that is hot that everyone's talking about versus one that is, unknown or old and stodgy. But I really do believe that, joining something cold is actually much more of an you have much more upwards mobility and much more opportunity than joining something hot. And it's just funny that still, knowing that, we look for great opportunities in the subject line. We kind of judge things at face value in that way. And there's so many times where I will talk to friends of mine who are considering jobs at like hot companies like Facebook, or small or unknown companies or whatever, and they're thinking, well, it's much safer to take this hot job, and and I'll say I work at Facebook, and I'm just like, how is that ever going to distinguish you? Like, Facebook is hot already. Like, what are you going to do that's going to make Facebook exponentially more interesting, that you're going to be proud of and you're going to learn from a career perspective? Instead, I think we should be looking for the things that are not clear, and I mean, it just goes without saying, but it's just a reminder to all of us to not rely on, on what's obvious, right? And to determine to work, be determined to work with a team and a problem you're passionate about, but sometimes, give some allowance to what something, will become. The last piece here is on as you're optimizing what you're building, you have to learn to gain confidence from the doubt you encounter along the way. I've shared before the story of a publisher that I knew, maybe 10 or 15 years ago at this point, who was on the fast track to being one of the head publishers at one of the major publishing conglomerates out there, and he was given an opportunity to lead a group called Digital Publishing. And people said, you're not going to throw your career away, and no one's ever going to read a book on a computer. Like, why would you ever take that job? And for whatever reason, the more people that said to him he's crazy for even considering this, because he was on such a fast track to begin with, the more confident he became, right? The more he said, well, wait a second. This means that I am seeing something right now that no one else sees. And this is a moment where I actually should not lose confidence from all the doubt I'm actually getting from people that know me, but actually gain it. It's a difference between criticism and cynicism, right? It's a difference between knowing whether people are not getting something because it's unfamiliar to them and it's on the cusp of what's new, it's unreasonable, it's at the edge of reason, or it's or you actually are missing something, you shouldn't be taking the job. But it's something to think about as we all reach a point in our lives, or already have, where we have to gain confidence from being doubted. And I think that's true for all of us. This notion that nothing extraordinary is ever achieved through ordinary means. We have to keep that in mind. So finish. So a little bit about kind of the end here, right? So you're enduring the lows, you're optimizing through the highs, and what is the finish? Well, actually, there is no finish, right? I mean, I think one of the tricks here is to always have that mentality of staying in the early innings. Always taking yourself back to the fact that as remarkable as whatever you created is, something else will come next, and it's either going to be from you or it's going to be from somewhere else. Everything you've learned, everything you've accomplished is just a foundation for what you're going to do next. This notion for you, and also keeping your team in the early innings, working and thinking like they're in the early innings. And there's so many examples of how companies bring this into practice. Facebook has this notion of keeping everyone in a certain amount of square feet to kind of keep them feeling like they're part of this early stage team and not part of a sprawling office. Amazon makes people build their own desk famously. Still to this day, they have these practices that keep them lean, and kind of this notion of we're still in the early innings of what we want to do. And so it's important to kind of bring this practice into how we think. When you look at what you've created or what you've influenced, it will be seductive to take credit for it. But I think it's important for us to recognize that the influence that we have over our teams or over an industry or whatever else is most effective without seeking attribution, because then everyone else that is actually making it happen knows that they own it. And it's an important distinction because as leaders, we start to tell ourselves stories of our role in something that are almost always exaggerations of what they really were. And it's actually the people that made it happen with you, every one of them, that actually has to take this kind of even distribution of attribution in order to keep it going. And I see a lot of teams actually disband because, and bands even, right? Where a lead singer kind of gets known and sort of takes overarching credit for everything that the band has accomplished. And then people are like, screw this, I'm out of here. So it's important to sustain the journey, right? And not to be finished in a bad way, is to make sure that influence is really where it needs to be. It goes back to the point about joining the right team, and again, like not joining something for what it is, but what you believe you can make it become. And I think when I advise people who are interviewing for opportunities, I'm always saying, like, don't just go there and try to please them and try to get the job, but really try to figure out, like, what is this team now that you're disappointed in? And what is your role going to be in making it into something different? Like, what do you bring? And I think there's that's like the real thing that we should be doing. We should be, and also working with clients for not what they are, but what we believe we can help them become. That keeps us, again, in this journey rather than ever being finished. So yeah, we should fear death, and we should also fear resting on any of our laurels, right? I mean, we should, and this goes without saying, but I admire people who just kind of think that their past is sort of an output of hard work and a lot of good luck and circumstance, and that everything forward is what matters, and that they're constantly moving forward. Which brings us back to this notion of curiosity. I think that if there's one thing that keeps us never finished, it's just insane and insatiable curiosity in the problems that we are solving. I'm reminded of one of the guys I work with a little bit at Benchmark, this guy named Bill Gurley, who's a very famous venture capitalist, super successful, could have retired 10 years ago if he wanted to from a financial perspective. He just is insatiably curious in like different industries and in different problems, and now it's healthcare. He'll just spend hours of a day on with a cardiologist, talking and learning about his or her problems in the practice and what they're dealing with in the industry and whatever. And it's that curiosity that keeps this man unfinished. And I think that's true for all of us. Curiosity is really what keeps us in the game. As a side note, I think a lot, and I'm sure a lot of us do these days, about like global issues and the nature of our country right now. And I mean, my biggest fear is that we become apathetic to what's going on. We almost become numb to the news, right? Whether it's a school shooting or whether it's some other sort of major problem that's happened in the White House, we are liable to just become apathetic to it. And at least for me, like what keeps me engaged civically is curiosity. I'm just trying to stay curious, about what can improve the nature of our country, what can actually move the needle in environmental issues that seem to be woefully ignored in this country now. I think that's one of the antidotes to the situation that we're living in today, is just to stay insatiably curious, about what we can do differently, what we can do better, new candidates, new movements, new organizations. This is what keeps us unfinished. This is what keeps us moving. This is what keeps us in the game. So with that, I want to thank you for having me.